Tonight on UCSD Conversations, Charles Curtis reflects on his musical career and his new role as chair of UCSD's performance ensemble, SONOR. Dr. Albert Leung looks at the use of acupuncture at UCSD's Center for Pain and Palliative Medicine, and Richard Marciano of the San Diego Supercomputer Center on redlining, affecting San Diego neighborhoods almost a century later. But first, the Jacobs School's Doug Ramsey welcomes Interim Dean Frieder Seible in an exploration of the wide variety of Homeland security projects underway there.
Hello everyone, I am Doug Ramsey. Our subject today is Homeland Security. Since September 11th, 2001, many research organizations have stepped up their research in areas related to the fight against terrorism and new technologies that could become available. At UCSD, the Jacobs School of Engineering has been at the forefront of that research offensive. Leading the way at the Jacobs School is Frieder Seible, who took over the summer of 2002 as interim dean of the Jacobs School. Seible is the Eric and Johanna Reisner Professor of Applied Mechanics and Structural Engineering and is a world-renowned expert in seismic design and retrofit of bridges to make them less vulnerable in the event of an earthquake. Seible is a former chair of the Structural Engineering Department and an innovator in large-scale structural testing as the founding director of the Charles Lee Powell Structural Research Laboratories at UCSD. He is also a pioneer in the use of composite materials in civil infrastructure renewal. Welcome, Frieder. Thanks for joining us today.
You're welcome.
First of all, since 9/11, has the role of the research university in general and of the Jacobs School in particular changed?
The role of research universities of the Jacobs School has changed in a sense that a lot of the research which we had been doing over the years now is refocusing towards Homeland Security. Even so, we are still waiting for a lot of the Homeland Security funding to come from Washington to the research universities. We have revisited our ongoing research and identified in the Jacobs School alone over 40 active research projects which are directly relevant to Homeland Security.
What was the process that you went through to find that out, and how soon after 9/11 did this process of refining the focus begin?
This happened immediately after 9/11, since some of the projects clearly are directly relevant to Homeland Security. For example, I was personally involved in blast testing for the Defense Threat Reduction Agency. On 9/11, we were actually in Albuquerque, New Mexico at Kirtland Air Force Base to do an actual blast test that day. And so some of the projects, as I said, had direct relevance to this effort. For example, on the blast testing which we were doing, this used to be a program to retrofit our embassies worldwide against terrorist attack. 9/11 brought this project just closer to home. Now we're looking at important structural facilities here in this country which need to be protected. And in a similar sense, a lot of ongoing research projects were immediately refocused following 9/11 in the Jacobs School. Other projects were identified over the next month or two as projects which could have a direct relevance to Homeland Security on biosensors, on other sensor networks which could be employed in addition to looking at, for example, structural performance, also at Homeland Security issues, namely standoff distances, unauthorized traffic on structures, and so on. So these are efforts which came about over the next 2 or 3 months. And then we solicited from the Dean's office in the Jacobs School just a request to all of our research, just tell us about their ongoing projects and their relevance to Homeland Security. And just this very simple question asked resulted in over 40 project statements.
How does the work at the Jacobs School in this area dovetail with what's going on at UCSD overall in this Homeland Security area?
Clearly, the Jacobs School is not the only entity here on campus working on Homeland Security-related issues. There are similar efforts going on in all the other divisions across the University of California, San Diego. And Chancellor Dines essentially asked or organized the research community at UCSD to see what we can do jointly as the University of California to contribute to Homeland Security. And what emerged from this request from Chancellor Dines is now an effort which is looking at San Diego as a region under the umbrella of a regional network for Homeland Security to discuss Homeland Security issues. And it's a joint effort with San Diego State Universities, with the Navy, SPAWAR, the Coast Guard, Caltrans, other government agencies, and then a lot of private industry organized through the San Diego Chamber of Commerce to really work under this umbrella of regional Homeland Security on common solutions addressing Homeland Security issues.
Presumably some of the technologies that are being developed at the Jacobs School would then be deployed as part of that overall network deployment?
Clearly, the Jacobs School, being the School of Engineering, is largely responsible for the technology end of things, for the individual gadgets which need to be developed and deployed, for the processes which need to be developed and deployed to really make Homeland Security a reality.
Is there a major overarching technology challenge that was posed by 9/11 and by this stepped up increase of interest in Homeland Security?
The overarching technology issues which emerged from 9/11 are in the area of information technology. And they're at the different levels. First of all, we have locally different units responding to disasters like 9/11, also natural disasters like earthquakes. And it is amazing to see how little communication there is amongst the individual units. So we have to first of all bring all the first responders after an incident like 9/11 to the stage where they can fully and effectively communicate with each other. But by the same token, we are also talking about a lot of data gathering in preparation for other possible incidents, in instrumenting our structures, in instrumenting whole regions with biosensors. This is all data which will be coming in now in huge data sets and needs to be managed and organized such that we can in the end really benefit from that data. We have to turn this data into knowledge, not just collect data, but we have to process that data, that we really gain knowledge from that data and can use it then afterwards much more effectively to prevent incidents like 9/11.
Before we talk about any specific projects, I've got to ask you, you are a structural engineer. One of the most indelible images that we still have with us today of 9/11 was the collapse, of course, of the two World Trade Center towers. Do you foresee as a structural engineer the day when one day perhaps that would not have happened if the same event had occurred?
Clearly, following the collapse of the World Trade Center towers, there was a lot of discussion, or is a lot of discussion in the structural engineering community, how an event like this can be prevented in the future. And clearly, the collapse of the World Trade Center towers were ultimately caused by the fire, the jet fuel fires in the buildings, which were burning so hot that the steel essentially lost its load-carrying capacity. And then we got the sequential or progressive collapse of the structures. Now we can work on better fireproofing methods. We can work on better fire extinguishing methods. For example, one of the issues in the World Trade Center was the fact that the sprinkler system probably was interrupted as soon as the airplanes hit the core of the building, and so there was no effective fire extinguishing system then in place. So these are all issues which we can work on as structural engineers to make improvements. That does not mean we can prevent something like this from happening in the future, but we can certainly make improvements. But another key aspect is, what about if we can instrument a building like the World Trade Center towers with a lot of sensors which give us instantaneous data back on the actual temperature of the steel in this building, and then when that temperature reaches a certain level, gives us a clear warning that now is the time to evacuate the building. Okay? This is technology which theoretically is available nowadays, but certainly was not in place at 9/11.
That's one technology. Blast mitigation, you mentioned earlier that you'd already been doing work as of September 11th on blast mitigation. What is the challenge there, and what is your approach to resolving the issues, and what type of blast mitigation are we talking about?
As I mentioned already, blast mitigation was primarily geared towards protecting our critical structures abroad, our embassies, our military installation against terrorist attacks. There the issue is that you have different threats, different blast loads, anything from what we call a satchel charge of about 100, 150 pounds, which you can put in a briefcase and place next to a column or a building, all the way to moving van charges of 5,000 pound TNT equivalent, meaning charges similar to what was used in Oklahoma City for the Murrah building. And that we look at these different threats, look at different explosives, C4, N4, the ammonium nitrite, fuel oil mixtures, look at different standoff distances, and then evaluate the effect of blasts on the actual structure, and then see what can we do to mitigate the effect of these blasts on the behavior of the structure in the form of retrofitting. Now we call it retrofitting of structures coming from the seismic side. In military terms, it's called hardening of structures. But essentially where we're coming from is that we are applying now technologies which were developed for the seismic retrofit of structures to blast mitigation of structures, to see how effective some of the same technologies are for structural hardening. And some of the technologies which we are specifically looking at is the wrapping of structural members using advanced composite materials such as carbon fiber, epoxy, materials, polymer matrix materials, which can then contain the actual structural materials, namely do not allow concrete, for example, to sprawl into millions of small pieces, but keep them in place during this very short and impulsive blast loading which we see in a terrorist attack.
A few of the other areas at the Jacobs School, computer vision is one, computer security, internet security, all these bioterrorism, these are all areas that the Jacobs School is working on?
In all of these areas we have typically more than one research project already ongoing. Clearly on the computer security side, this is extremely important now that we're collecting data from all these other sensors we talked already about. We have to make sure that the data from these sensors is only looked at and processed by the right clientele in the end. So computer security becomes a major issue. So even our sensor networks, which we are dealing with in the physical infrastructure, in the end require the cyber infrastructure security blanket on top of it. Also in the bioengineering area, a lot of work is being done with biosensors to sense chemical or bio terrorist attacks in the environment. And then also on the vision side, several of our faculty are working on computer vision aspects of Homeland Security, pattern recognition, face recognition, retina recognition. So these are all aspects which are already implemented in a lot of cases in airports when we go through screenings every day, when we use air traffic. So a lot of these are areas where the Jacobs School is actively involved in ongoing research projects.
Presumably you could also construe that Homeland Security would include protection from natural disasters, for instance, earthquakes, in particular in the structural engineering area. Here you essentially created the Powell Labs in 1986 when it was commissioned. It's been going strong, expanding since then. What is the role that the labs have played in this effort to get a better handle on better construction, better retrofitting in the case of earthquakes?
The Powell Structural Research Laboratories are known for their capability to test very large, or in most cases even full-scale structural systems. And so the major role we are playing there is that for structural design, clearly structural design is done using analytical models. But these analytical models need to be verified and validated to make sure that they really can predict the actual performance of the structure. And this is where the larger full-scale tests in the Powell Labs come in then, namely the testing of not just the individual components of structures, but complete full-scale structural systems to then validate the analytical models against the test results which we see in our laboratory experiments. These tests can be as big as the testing of 5-story full-scale buildings. This is what the Powell Structural Systems Laboratory was designed for, that we can test structures up to 5 stories tall under simulated seismic loads all the way to failure. And so these are the kind of tests which are currently ongoing in the Powell laboratories in direct support of seismic research, but more recently now also in direct support of blast mitigation, for example, against terrorist attacks.
And you mentioned earlier, of course, the discussion about composites. And again, in that field, you're also talking about new construction. You've even got this advanced technology bridge that's been on the drawing board for some time now. What's the status of that?
Yeah, clearly we cannot just retrofit or harden existing structures against terrorist attack or against earthquakes, but we can also build new structural systems using these advanced composite materials. For example, a new construction system has been developed here in the Power Labs at UCSD, where we use carbon shells, which we use as the formwork and the reinforcement for reinforced concrete components. And so we just take a preformed carbon shell, which is very light. Typically you can move it just by people or very light lifting equipment. You put it in place and fill it with concrete, and then you walk away from it basically. You leave the shell in place as formwork and as reinforcement at the same time. And so clearly a concrete column which has been built in this particular fashion can also withstand not just earthquakes but blast loads, as we have shown with our blast experiments which we're doing currently in New Mexico at White Sands and at Kirtland Air Force Base.
I understand that you're also now working on the sort of the next phase for the Powell Labs, what would tantamount to be the largest shake table in the country for large structures outdoors?
Yeah, the next big addition to the Powell Labs will be a outdoor shake table. It's the world's first outdoor shake table, which we have planned to be built at Camp Elliott, which is 8 miles east of the UC San Diego campus. And this is a big project which will be funded hopefully soon by the National Science Foundation as part of a network for earthquake engineering simulation, where they are outfitting about 15 laboratories across the country with new technologies to really give us, again, edge in leadership in earthquake engineering testing in this country. And at UCSD, for the Power Labs, we are getting an outdoor shake table where we can build full-scale structures then on this shake table. No height limitations, that's why we want to do it outdoors. No lifting capacity limitations. And where we can then test full-scale structural systems under real earthquake input by shaking the base of the building to see the effect of earthquakes on actual structural systems.
Wrapping up now very briefly, where do you see the Jacobs School going next, especially going back to this issue of Homeland Security and the role that it's going to play going forward?
In my mind, the Jacobs School is really uniquely positioned to make a significant contribution to Homeland Security because of all the projects which are ongoing already and the synergy which we have in terms of cross-disciplinary research amongst different departments within the Jacobs School. We are working extensively now in structural engineering with sensors developed in the electrical engineering department, with software developed in the computer engineering department to really take structural protection, for example, to the next level. And this is really, I think, an area where the Jacobs School is uniquely positioned to make significant contributions to Homeland Security.
Frieder Seible, Interim Dean of the Jacobs School, thank you very much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Next on Conversations, Charles Curtis discusses his evolution from classically trained cellist to experimental music champion as chair of SONOR, UCSD's new music performance ensemble.
I grew up in Laguna Beach, just up the coast here, and so I had a kind of an interesting combination of a Southern California beach community life and also a very serious involvement in music, which was kind of, you know, a contrast. My parents were both very interested in music. My mother was an excellent musician. She played, she was German, and she played a lot of German instruments like the zither, and she played the violin and the piano and recorder and things like that. And she sang very beautifully. And so she would sing these German folk songs to us when we were children. My father was not a musician per se. He was an English teacher, a high school English teacher. But he loved music, and he always said that his role was to listen. He was the audience. My brother, who's 2 years older than I am, started playing the piano when he was 5. So it was already a presence in our house by the time I was 3, and of course my mother was very musical, as I said. And so when I was 5, I also started the piano. And then they decided that 2 pianists was not such a great idea, so they gave me the choice of what other instrument I would like to learn. And I picked the cello, and so I think I started the cello when I was about 6. Well, I picked the cello because at that time as a 6-year-old I thought that I would get a lot of laughs at school. See, I thought it would be a very humorous instrument. I don't know why I thought that. I think maybe because it's so low. I thought I would pluck these low notes and everybody would laugh. So that's why I picked the cello. And I would say that it was at about the age of 12 that I decided this is the main thing for me. Up until then, I also played the trombone, I also sang, and I also acted very seriously. And so it was a very specific decision. I always knew I was going to do something in music somehow. And I think the reason at that point why I began to concentrate on the cello is because it seemed like an extremely serious instrument. So exactly the opposite of the reason why I started it in the first place. When I was 15 years old, I played the Saint-Saëns Concerto with the Young Musicians Foundation Orchestra in Los Angeles. And a couple of months before that, I gave my first full cello recital, solo recital, at a college out in the desert somewhere. And so I would say that I was a professional soloist and performer from the age of about 15. So I went to New York for the first time at 17, and I went on to New York to study at the age of 18. I played in Carnegie Hall for the first time in a trio with a a very well-known pianist named Earl Wild and a great violinist named Oscar Shumsky when I was 19, I think. So yeah, I was quite professional still as a teenager already. I got into new music at a surprisingly early age. My brother is a composer and a pianist, and in fact he's a graduate of UCSD. He got a master's here. And so I knew about UCSD already when he was a student here, and I visited him here and gave a recital with him here quite some time ago. But I think due to the fact that he was a very serious composer when we were both teenagers, just gave me a kind of a pathway into new music that was really, really important to me. Well, as I said, I knew about this department for a very long time, and the department is very well known in other parts of the world, in New York and in Europe, probably better known there than it is in San Diego. And I knew a number of the people who were teaching here. I knew people who had studied here, Mark Dresser, Diamanda Gallis, my brother, Henry Curtis, who was a graduate student here, and I had been here while he was a student. It never occurred to me that I would consider coming here and living here. I never thought I'd live in California again. But it was, I guess, primarily through my friend Alec Karras, the professor of piano here, with whom I'd played in New York many, many times over the years. I guess it was through him. He just kind of called me once out of the blue and said, Charles, the surf is really great out here. That was his recruitment line. And at that point, we started talking about it. I came out as a visitor twice. And it took a long time for everybody to kind of figure out that this was the right thing to do. And I think the process of my actually coming here and taking the job was a process that took almost 3 years. What is SONOR? That's a very difficult thing to define. You know, when I teach my experimental music classes, I play them experimental music, new music, and they often say, well, that's not music. And so I'm forced to try and clear them up on what music is. So I say that music is continually in the process of figuring out what it is. Music is the process of discovering what music is. And I think you could kind of say that about SONOR. Every concert, we're sort of reinterpreting the idea of what SONOR is. It is the forum for the UCSD performance faculty. However, it's not a clearly defined new music ensemble because it's comprised frequently of graduate students, also of musicians from the community, and of different parts of the performance faculty, and indeed different parts of the music faculty. Sometimes the composers are involved, sometimes the improvisers are involved. So I think that I think it's good that way. I think it's nice that it doesn't have a clear-cut definition. It's not an ensemble. It's not a concert series. It is a forum for what's going on here. We couldn't quite figure out what my title is exactly in terms of SONOR. They call me a chairman, but am I a director or an artistic director or a program director or something like that? I don't know what it is, and the funny thing is I was selected for this post in my absence, right? So they had this faculty meeting and they needed to decide who was going to look after SONOR, and they nominated me and voted for me without my even knowing about it. So when I got back, they said, well, you're in charge. I just try to take each program and find out, what is really essential in that program, and I try to craft a program around it that makes sense and that is atmospherically and intellectually of a piece. And so I think it would be nice if SONOR performed in the city a little bit more than we have done recently. So I'm working on that, and I think that would help to get people from the city to come up here, so that it's not just the university community that come to these concerts.
Next on Conversations, stay tuned for research on the uses of acupuncture as a complementary therapy to manage chronic pain with Dr. Albert Leung.
From the pain management standpoint, a palliative standpoint, we do use or recommend complementary therapy to patients who have failed conventional treatments, such as medications or injection therapy that we provide. And so in that regard, complementary medicine does provide alternative options for these patients. The complementary medicine, the scope of it is pretty broad. And there are different means of pharmacological agents, so-called dye supplements of health products. And in addition to that, there are different other non-pharmacological means of complementary medicine, such as yoga, Qigongs, healing touch, meditation, and so forth.
Well, other clinics look at treating a disease with some goal of either controlling it or curing the disease. We are no longer doing anything about a particular condition. We are treating symptoms. We are looking at making people feel better and improving function, giving them some quality of life back.
The way I look at it, all pain has a nerve implication to it, and when you have an injury, the nerve system obviously being activated and so forth. That requires more intense treatments. And otherwise, I think the patient will, in the long run, lose function of the limbs or the area where they have the pain. Acupuncture, the history of acupuncture has been quite extensive. It dates back probably 4,000 to 5,000 years ago. And it has been used in different countries. First literature of acupuncture is probably being included in traditional Chinese medicine literatures. That's about 200 BC ago. The theory of acupuncture is primarily based on traditional Chinese medicine's theory about how human body works. Use the term so-called a qi, which is the energy they thought flow through the human bodies and regulates the different types of functions of human bodies and the well-being of human bodies. And the qi has a sort of a channel, if you might, sort of the different connections of the human bodies and so-called the meridians. And the thinking is that when the patient has an illness or a pain, there's some obstructions of the meridians. Either there's too much qi or there's a deficiency of the qi. As a result of that, by manipulating the meridian, which is the acupuncture points, one can reverse the imbalance of the qi. That's traditional Chinese medicine in the short term, how acupuncture works. In terms of the use of acupuncture in pain, there have been quite a few studies been done in terms of different chronic pain conditions and their response to acupuncture. The NIH has a consensus that been made in somewhere in 1998. They essentially put two of these conditions as effective in response to acupuncture, which include post-operative or post-chemo nausea, vomiting, as well as post-dental pain. These are conclusively they felt as effective In addition to that, they also label a few other pain conditions such as fibromyalgia, chronic headache, low back pain, carpal tunnel syndromes, and some of the non-pain conditions such as addictions, smoking, as likely be effective.
Sometimes acupuncture is used because everything else has been tried. There are a small group of patients that we've done medicines, we've done injections, they've had multiple surgeries, and nothing has really helped. For some of those patients, acupuncture on a regular basis is really their only option.
In general, I think acupuncture provides good relief for patients with certain pain conditions, such as mainly musculoskeletal pain, such as low back pain or neck pain or shoulder pains, and works quite well for certain neurological, nerve-related type of problems, such as nerve impingement in the cervical or lumbar areas. The response of acupuncture tend to be less effective when there's an ongoing mechanical problem, such as if a patient has a degenerative joint disease, has acute joint pain. The relief tend to be quite short-lasting.
Patients who have been ill for a long time are needle shy. I think that's the biggest thing. And you know, we're gonna present this option to a patient, but by the way, we're gonna stick multiple needles in your skin. And though most of the needles are painless, there are some of the sticks that cause a slight amount of discomfort. And so there is that uneasiness on the part of patients.
The needles are very small, actually. Most of the time, the patient won't even feel the needle goes in. It's usually 31 gauge needles, which is much smaller than the IV needle that we typically use in the hospitals. So in terms of the depth of the needle could be variable. It largely depends on patient's response. The dull achiness, so-called dai chi feelings in acupuncture literature is what we usually look for when we're inserting the needle, is looking for patient to report sort of mild tingling, dull achiness sensation when we insert those needles. That becomes important in terms of establishing the overall efficacy of the acupuncture treatment. The risk of acupuncture is very minimal. I think it's probably less than placing IV catheters in someone. Most of the treatment, as a matter of fact, is provided with electrical acupuncturists. Electrical acupuncture is primarily provided through electrical stimulations using direct currents. I do use moxibustions for certain patients. Moxibustion is essentially using a herb, Chinese herb, is being lit up. When the herb and the film that being generated from the herb, when it's provided around the needle, it provides a sort of heating sensation around the needles. And the aroma itself provide a sense of relaxation for a lot of patients.
I think 5 years ago, acupuncture wouldn't have been seen as an integrated approach. A lot of the research hadn't been published yet. I'm not sure it would be accepted in a university setting, but now it is well researched. There is data. In this university setting, it's accepted as a modality. We accept it as a privilege granted to physicians with the appropriate training. The advantage of coming to a physician acupuncturist is that if your physician is a pain specialist, your physician knows how to integrate this particular therapy into the rest of the treatment program, as opposed to an acupuncturist who really isn't looking at the total health picture for a patient.
I think having all the other tools available, having a clear diagnosis what the underlying pathology is, give us a better understanding what the patient's need is in terms of both physiologically and psychologically what the patient needs as well. And in that regard, it does provide us with better information in choosing the type of acupuncture that might benefit patients.
Most of the drugs we give, although they have an effect, an analgesic effect, they also have side effects. They have sedation perhaps, or nausea. And acupuncture doesn't really have any side effects. Acupuncture, for just about every patient we treat, makes them feel better. So it's very easy to suggest a treatment to a patient that will hopefully help their pain problem. And oh, by the way, you're actually going to feel better when this is done.
I think one of the common questions being raised about acupuncture is whether acupuncture is a purely placebo effect that patients are experiencing. And there have been several lines of evidence that indicate that acupuncture is not a purely placebo effect. One of these evidence is that acupuncture has been used for surgery in veterinary medicines in animals that should not have placebo or know that you're doing something to achieve a surgical analgesia. Another line of evidence is that acupuncture is not a purely placebo effect. It works in pediatric populations. So that also argues against acupuncture as a purely placebo effect. Finally, I think acupuncture is known to, the pain relief benefit is known to can be reversed by naloxone, which is a drug that used to reverse the effect of opioid, morphine, and so forth. So that leads to suggestions acupuncture has a role in regulating neurohormonal response, such as endorphin release. And some of these research had actually suggest that endorphin does play a role in the actual mechanism of acupuncture.
As a nurse, I'm usually talking to them and making sure they understand the procedure. I tend to tailor that education session to the patient. We have some very well-informed patients that are pretty open to complementary therapies. For the majority of patients, I really do present it as a therapy that does help balance the body, because it does. It balances the energy, but it also balances their emotions, which again, anything that balances the emotions induces a relaxation response, helps with anxiety, we know scientifically helps with pain, and that's probably the thing I present to every patient.
The inherent difficulty of conducting a study with acupuncture is under Western scientific methods, is what do you use for control for acupuncturists. There have been different ways of doing sham acupunctures, different methods of doing that. The other question is sham acupuncture good control? Are you, even though you are maybe 2 or 3 centimeters off the meridians, you're still providing some sort of stimulations? There's some preliminary data currently available from functional MRI study that suggests that even though you stimulate these sham points, you might still get a response in the brain. So it goes into my interest of research is to study how the brain actually responds to acupuncturists. We currently have a research model that's looking at using peripheral sensory testing as well as the functional brain imaging to try to establish a correlation between actual response in the peripheral level and see what happened in the brain as well. My hope is in the future we can conduct more high-quality research to actually establish the mechanisms of acupuncture. In doing so, I think we can gain more acceptance acupuncture in the mainstream medical communities.
Finally tonight, Richard Marciano, a research scientist at the San Diego Supercomputer Center at UCSD. He discovered some documents which he believes are still making an impact on the way banks and real estate agents do business in San Diego.
Well, Richard, thank you so much for joining us. This is a very difficult subject to understand, so hopefully you can help us understand what it really is all about. Is it correct to say that you stumbled upon this information?
That's pretty accurate. I actually came here 7 years ago, was completely new to San Diego, and sort of came across traces of this historical information in bits and pieces.
Why San Diego? Why did you decide to focus your efforts on San Diego?
I kept hearing murmurs of documents, of exclusionary zones, of notations and mentions on property deeds, of former policies that had affected San Diego, and wasn't quite able to put my finger on that. So one thing led to another, and when I finally, in a professional setting, had an opportunity to start working with the National Archives, which is a federal agency in Washington, D.C., I was able to go to the records portion of the National Archives and discover some of the core documents that really were seminal in putting all of these pieces together.
This is what you found in a nutshell. Can you kind of go through and describe for us what it is that you discovered?
Yes, these happen to be records of a federal agency born in the aftermath of the Great Depression called Homeowners Loan Corporation, which was one of these New Deal federal agencies signed off by FDR. HOLC, as it's called, was created in 1933 and was quickly followed by FHA. This agency's primarily goal was to increase home ownership at a time of depression in the home market when prices were plummeting. And really had a goal of reviving the whole building and mortgage industry. And in so doing, they hoped to boost employment and help the economy. So they were very laudable goals. It conducted extensive surveys of all major American cities, I think of all cities of more than 40,000 inhabitants, sent testers in the field and compiled detailed securities, maps, and documents that highlighted the economic, demographic conditions of cities, discussed the home market conditions, and proposed solutions to get out of this housing crisis. One of the more profound side effects of the works of the whole corporation was the institutionalization of appraisal practices for homes. And this agency is largely credited for creating the mortgage system that is still in use today.
What does redlining mean?
Redlining is an interesting term. It actually refers to the color on these maps of the 1930s and 40s. And this happens to be the particular confidential security map for San Diego. It was part of the San Diego file. And essentially the color code that was used on these maps was green, blue, yellow, and red. So a classification system of 4 categories. Green being the most desirable areas, those that needed to be protected, where investment needed to be encouraged, where house prices had to hold. And red at the bottom of the scale being areas of blight, areas that indicated urban decay and lower economic conditions. The interesting thing about this classification system is that race was part and parcel of the color coding and the attribution of neighborhood grades and neighborhood colors. And in effect, the presence of any undesirable ethnic element in one of these areas was often sufficient to downgrade the particular rating or color a neighborhood would receive. And this was very significant in terms of securing and obtaining housing loans. I think one of the statistics that is frequently cited is that over a 30-year period between the 1930s and 60s, of the $120 billion of loans that were doled out, less than 2% apparently went to families or non-white families in poor areas.
So you see the maps here and you get into what neighborhoods were deemed as better than others, basically. What happens after that?
What you almost see in a visual fashion on this map of San Diego are containment zones. The first thing that comes to your mind when you look at these maps at a superficial level is that most of southeast San Diego and other portions of San Diego were singled out for economic disinvestment back in the 30s. So this was a very strong intent. These are often can be seen as really containment zones, and there are various researchers have looked at this and interpreted this as buffer zones, and the whole philosophy of the preservation of the integrity of neighborhoods and mortgage prices is based on the protection against adverse influences and the isolation of groups. So I found that absolutely mind-boggling and quite fascinating when I started looking into it.
You've selected several San Diego neighborhoods to show examples of what you're talking about. Can you point them out?
An interesting area maybe to start with would be from the bottom of the scale, or the so-called red color, or category D. And interestingly enough, if one were to look at the redlining map of La Jolla in 1935, you see a little redlined area called D1. And by pulling the descriptive text, the rationale for the rating for that area, you will start to get a sense of the model that was used for rating neighborhoods. So this particular area is known as the servants' quarters of La Jolla, being populated with the serving class of whites, Negroes, and Mexicans. So while populated with this lower social strata, the area is considered good security for conservative loans. This particular area is set aside by common consent for the colored population. So you see really a containment zone within a neighborhood that serves a particular purpose here. And it's many people who have analyzed the redlining maps of San Diego have come across what appears to be an anomaly at first in the case of La Jolla. The next color going up the coloring system would be yellow, and it would be interesting to pull a portion of Coronado for this particular map. And what I've added here is the bridge, which obviously did not exist back in the 1930s, but right off of the exit of the bridge, there's an area here called C10, which is a yellow area. This particular yellow area, I quote, lies along the bay, and in this area is located the servants' quarters, or the colored population of Coronado. There is considerable building going on at this time, and were it not for the colored population in a dump, this area might be classified as a B, or blue color. So this is quite interesting, and you see that embedded in this description you have not only ethnic and racial considerations, but also environmental factors. And if one were to analyze sort of the attributes that determine the rating and coloring of a particular neighborhood, one could come up with the following categories. And this is what I illustrated in another neighborhood, Mission Hills in this particular case, which has two colored areas, the two remaining areas, blue, B11, and green, A7. And the attributes that describe the neighborhood evaluation model deal with the following 8 categories: stability of the neighborhood, protection from adverse influences, adequacy of transportation, appeal of the neighborhood, sufficiency of utilities and conveniences, level of taxes and special assessments, presence of civic, social, and commercial centers, and finally, topography and special hazards of neighborhoods. And if we were to look at the second category, which is almost the top category, it's 20% of the grade, what you will see here is a typical description of the rationale for why this area is colored as a blue. Particular mention states, I quote, "No infiltration of any inharmonious influences, no influx of any foreign element in that area. My sense is that it was still quite subjective, that an appraiser had the right to downgrade the rating of a neighborhood to yellow or red based on the mere presence of one family that belonged to one of these so-called undesirable foreign groups.
So Richard, you first find out about the neighborhoods, about the individual neighborhoods. Now it sounds like you found even more, that it affects deeds.
A series of very systematic and sort of deadly tools were put in place. And I will read from this particular quote. "Protection against adverse influences is obtained by the existence and enforcement of proper zoning, as well as appropriate deed restrictions." And the connection between deeds and the redlining type zoning is inescapable. In the underwriting manuals and in the descriptions of the redlined areas and neighborhoods, so-called securities maps, you will find explicit mentions that the only reason an area is getting a green rating is because it also has protection through deeds. You will find at times descriptions that certain neighborhoods cannot be given a sort of blank check and are downgraded to blue or yellow because they have sort of security gaps in their implementation of the use of the deed tool or the restriction or exclusion by deed.
If someone has a vast interest in learning more about this issue or about your study, how can they do that?
One of my motivations, primary motivations, has been to reveal this information, digitize it, put it in a format that can be shared with researchers, students, the larger public. And we will be posting all this information and the data and the maps themselves with all the ratings. I'm hoping that, concerning the study of base maps of San Diego and the importance of this historical background and how it shaped the landscape and the development of neighborhoods in San Diego, that others would feel motivated and inspired to go beyond this first layer and develop other interesting and revealing studies.
Thank you very much, Richard, for sharing this information. Very fascinating and incredible that it was that you stumbled upon it. So thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me and for your interest.